For a few years, BYD looked like the answer to every question the auto industry was asking. How do you beat Tesla? BYD figured it out. How do you dominate the world's largest car market? BYD did it. How do you build an electric vehicle cheaper than anyone thought possible and still turn a profit? BYD wrote the playbook. And then, in the span of about 18 months, almost everything started going wrong at once. Profits down more than 55% in a single quarter. Over 300,000 vehicles recalled inside a year. Dealerships that were open on Monday and shuttered by Friday. A fire at their own headquarters that sent shockwaves through an industry already watching them nervously. So what actually happened to the company that was supposed to own the future? That's what we're getting into today. And I'll warn you up front, the answer is more complicated and more revealing than the headlines suggest. Because this isn't a story about one thing going wrong. It's a story about what happens when a company builds an empire at a speed that the empire itself cannot support. Let's go back to the beginning. Not the car business, the real beginning. Shenzhen, China. Wang Chuanfu is 29 years old, has a chemistry degree, roughly $300,000 in capital, and an idea that sounds almost embarrassingly simple in hindsight. Japanese battery manufacturers control the global market for rechargeable cells and charge accordingly. Wang believes he can reverse engineer their process, rebuild it domestically, and undercut their prices. No automotive ambitions, no grand vision about the future of transportation, just a chemist who spotted an inefficiency and decided to exploit it. Within 5 years, he was the largest nickel-cadmium battery manufacturer on Earth. A few years after that, the largest lithium-ion supplier too. Nokia and Motorola were customers. The company that started in a rented factory had become the backbone of the mobile phone revolution. But Wang was already thinking about what battery technology would power next. In 2003, he bought a failing state-owned automaker called Qinchuan Automobile. Everyone around him thought it was a mistake. His board pushed back. Industry analysts called it a distraction from a business that was already working. And on the surface, the skepticism was reasonable. Wang had never designed a car, never managed an assembly line, never navigated the regulatory complexity of the automotive industry. What the skeptics were calculating incorrectly was the actual nature of the bet. Wang wasn't betting on becoming a car company. He was betting that the car industry was about to become a battery industry, and that when that transition happened, whoever had spent the previous decade mastering battery technology at scale would have an advantage that no amount of automotive heritage could overcome. He saw the electric vehicle not as a variation of the car, but as a fundamentally different product that happened to have wheels. Strip away the body panels and the interior, and what you have is a battery system. The motor, the controls, the software, all of it exists to manage and deploy the energy in that battery. Wang already understood batteries better than almost anyone on Earth. The rest was engineering. For the first decade, BYD's cars were unremarkable. Competent enough to sell, derivative enough to be forgettable. But the car business wasn't really the point yet. The point was building the infrastructure, the patents, the manufacturing processes, the engineering talent, and most importantly, the technology that would eventually matter. That technology was the Blade battery. Most EV batteries at the time were built in a specific way. Individual cells got packed into modules. Modules got assembled into packs. It was an architecture the entire industry had inherited from early EV development, and almost nobody had seriously questioned. BYD questioned it. Their engineers redesigned the cell geometry entirely, creating long, flat cells that could slot directly into the structural pack without the module layer in between. The result used 50% more of the available space for actual energy storage, cost significantly less to produce, and passed the nail penetration test without thermal runaway. The test where you literally drive a nail through a fully charged battery pack and see what happens. In most lithium-ion chemistries, what happens is fire. In the Blade, the temperature rises and then stops. That's it. Tesla's early cells failed that test. The Blade passed, and BYD kept the technology entirely proprietary. Now combine that battery with something even more strategically significant. BYD doesn't just make batteries, they make the motors, the chips, the power electronics, the glass, the steel, and increasingly the semiconductors. The entire vehicle, almost from raw material to finished product, comes from within the BYD ecosystem. When the global chip shortage paralyzed the auto industry in 2021 and Ford was parking thousands of nearly finished trucks because it couldn't source semiconductors, BYD called its own chip division and kept building. That is not a minor operational difference. That is a categorically different kind of company. In 2022, Wang made the call that crystallized everything. BYD would stop producing pure combustion vehicles entirely. Every car going forward, electric or plug-in hybrid, no exceptions. No safety net, no hedge against the possibility that the transition might take longer than expected. The entire company all in on a future that hadn't fully arrived yet. The timing was close to perfect. Chinese government incentives for EV purchases were still generous. Consumer demand was accelerating. And BYD had products covering every price point, from a $15,000 compact to a flagship SUV with a battery enclosure sealed tightly enough to drive through a flooded street. By 2023, BYD had overtaken Volkswagen as the top-selling car brand in China. Every car, every brand, in the largest auto market on earth. By 2024, BYD outsold Tesla globally in total EV deliveries. The company Wang had built from a rented factory and a chemistry degree had become the biggest electric vehicle manufacturer on the planet. Warren Buffett's early investment had grown into one of the most profitable bets in Berkshire Hathaway's history. New factories were under construction across Hungary, Brazil, Thailand, Turkey, and Uzbekistan. Every analyst reached for the same word: unstoppable. Here's what that word actually means in practice. It means everyone stopped looking for the cracks. In May 2025, BYD announced simultaneous price reductions across 22 models, some as deep as 34%. Certain vehicles dropped by the equivalent of $10,000 overnight. The framing from BYD's communications team was confident. This was market consolidation. This was a company using its cost advantage as a weapon, daring smaller competitors to follow it somewhere they couldn't afford to go. The market read it differently. BYD's stock dropped 8% the same day the announcement came out, because investors understood what deep simultaneous price cuts across 22 models actually signal: not dominance, inventory pressure. And when analysts started pulling on that thread, what they found was significant. Dealerships across China were sitting on more than 3 months of unsold vehicles, more than double what a healthy operation carries. The factories had never slowed down, but the customers had. BYD had done what fast-growing companies often do. It had confused its production capacity with market demand and built forecasts around the number it wanted to be true rather than the number the market was producing. And by the time that gap became impossible to ignore, it had been growing quietly for months. What made it worse was that BYD's competitive environment had fundamentally changed. The Chinese EV market BYD had essentially created had become extraordinarily crowded. Dozens of domestic manufacturers had studied BYD's model and replicated it. NIO, XPeng, Li Auto, Leapmotor, Zeekr, all of them competing for a pool of buyers that was growing more slowly than the number of cars being built for it. Meanwhile, the government purchase incentives that had turbocharged the entire market were being gradually withdrawn. Demand softened. Supply didn't. When that happens, the only lever is price. And once one major player starts cutting, the rest have to follow or lose share. The price war that erupted across the Chinese auto industry between 2023 and 2025 destroyed an estimated $69 billion in revenue across the sector. Average new vehicle prices fell more than 11% across the entire market in 3 years. The situation got severe enough that regulators had to formally ban below-cost selling, a rule that required inventing specifically because companies were already doing it just to keep production lines moving and workers employed. BYD followed the rule technically, then kept discounting through rebates, trade-in bonuses, and bundled insurance packages. The inventory kept moving, the margins kept compressing, and the financial results told the story nobody wanted to read out loud. First quarter 2026, net profit down more than 55% year over year, revenue off nearly 12%. Domestic market share dropped from 33% to 26% in 12 months. And underneath those numbers, a detail that reframes the entire picture. In 2025, BYD received over 12 billion yuan in government subsidies, representing nearly 40% of its total net profit for the year. Remove the state support, and the underlying business wasn't generating the returns the headline figures implied. The manufacturing brilliance was real, but the profitability was being quietly subsidized in a way the company wasn't advertising. The stress wasn't only showing up in financial statements, it was showing up at the dealerships. April 2025. Shandong Changjing Holdings, one of BYD's largest dealer networks, went dark almost without warning. More than 20 locations, over 1,200 employees. Roughly 3 billion yuan in annual business. One of its showrooms had been formally recognized as the premier BYD flagship store in the country. Within weeks, every door was closed. Customers who had paid in advance for multi-year service agreements, maintenance packages, and insurance plans found themselves holding contracts worth nothing. Some staff reportedly went 6 months without a paycheck. BYD and the dealer group each issued statements blaming the other. The customers caught in the middle had no particular interest in the corporate dispute. Investigators found evidence of channel stuffing throughout the dealer network, a practice where a manufacturer pressures dealers to absorb more inventory than demand justifies, protecting the factory's shipment numbers while steadily transferring the financial risk downstream. The supplier network was experiencing its own version of the same squeeze. Leaked communications from late 2024 showed BYD pushing suppliers for another 10% cost reduction on top of margins that were already being described internally as unsustainable. And researchers at GMT Research, the firm whose analysis helped expose the true scale of the Evergrande collapse, estimated BYD's real adjusted debt at approximately 323 billion yuan, more than 10 times the official figure, built through extended supplier payment terms rather than conventional borrowing, which kept the obligations off the balance sheet while they kept accumulating. If you've stayed with this so far, hit subscribe and the notification bell. We cover the global auto industry the way it deserves to be covered. No loyalty to brands or countries, just the story wherever it leads. Okay, back to it. Because it was also during this period that BYD's quality record started developing a pattern that was hard to explain away as coincidence. September 2024, around 97,000 Dolphin and Yuan Plus vehicles recalled over a steering defect with associated fire risk. January 2025, roughly 7,000 Yangwang Yu 8 SUVs, fire risk again. October 2025, the largest recall of the cycle, over 115,000 Tang SUVs and Yuan Pro EVs, covering a drive motor controller that could damage its own circuit board, combined with battery housings whose sealing was insufficient to prevent water ingress. November 2025, nearly 89,000 Chin Plus hybrids recalled for a battery defect capable of causing sudden total power loss while driving. More than 300,000 vehicles across 14 months, each with its own specific technical cause. But the pattern underneath all of them pointed at the same pressure point. A production system running at its limits, with cost reduction targets eating into the engineering tolerances that reliable manufacturing depends on. Consumer footage filled in the picture publicly, interior panels that flexed visibly under light pressure, a structural component on a $42,000 model that testers could deform by hand, rust appearing on the body of a 2-year-old vehicle. These weren't isolated owner complaints. There were consistent documentation of corners being cut systematically to hit price targets that the market was demanding and the company had committed itself to meeting. Then in April 2026, a fire broke out in a parking structure at BYD's Shenzhen headquarters. Footage of thick black smoke pouring from the building circulated within minutes. For a company with 300,000 recent recalls already in public memory, the immediate interpretation was predictable: a battery fire. At company HQ, the worst possible symbolism at the worst possible moment. Investigators determined the cause was far more mundane. Contractors working in a storage area near scrapped vehicles had accidentally ignited insulation material. No injuries, no battery defect, no product issue of any kind. But here's the thing about trust. Once it erodes past a certain point, the facts stop being the first thing people reach for. BYD's Blade battery has genuine safety credentials and independent testing. That didn't change the public reaction, because the public wasn't evaluating the fire in isolation. They were evaluating it against 14 months of recalls and a stream of owner videos. The fire was the last piece of a picture that had already been forming without it. Now, the question that comes up constantly: why hasn't BYD cracked the American market? The simple answer is that they haven't been allowed to try. The U.S. currently applies a 100% tariff on Chinese manufactured EVs, layered on top of regulatory requirements around connected vehicle software and component sourcing. At that tariff level, importing and pricing competitively is mathematically impossible. BYD hasn't lost ground in America. The door was locked before they got there. So the global expansion went everywhere else instead. Over 70 countries, new factories in Hungary, Thailand, Brazil, Turkey, and Uzbekistan. The 2026 overseas sales target raised to 1.5 million vehicles, but international growth has its own resistance. The EU added a 17.4% duty on top of existing tariffs, explicitly citing Chinese state subsidies as market distortion. Brazil raised its own barriers. When Chinese auto exports more than doubled in a single month in early 2026, importing countries responded with the kind of defensive trade measures that kind of volume surge reliably produces. The long-term answer to tariff walls is local manufacturing, and BYD is building it. A factory inside the EU avoids the EU tariff. A factory in Brazil serves the Brazilian market domestically, but factories take years to reach meaningful volume. They need local supply chains, trained workers, regulatory approvals, and time that a company managing a 55% profit collapse and a domestic market share in retreat doesn't have an unlimited supply. So here's the full picture. BYD built something genuinely remarkable. The battery technology is real, the manufacturing scale is real, outselling Tesla was real, becoming China's most popular car brand was real. None of that gets erased by what came after. But the foundation underneath those achievements was never as solid as the growth numbers made it appear. The company scaled production faster than demand could absorb. It scaled its dealer network faster than the dealers could sustain. It scaled its cost reduction targets faster than its quality systems could handle. And it built a profitability picture that looked strong on paper while quietly depending on state support for nearly 40% of its net income. Those aren't 5 separate problems. They're one problem with 5 faces. A company that treated speed as a substitute for discipline and kept accelerating long after the early signs suggested it should have been consolidating. In business, that build doesn't arrive gradually. It arrives all at once. And in 2025 and 2026, BYD got handed theirs in full. More than 300,000 recalled vehicles, a profit collapse that cut earnings in half in a single quarter, dealer networks that took customers' money and then disappeared, a debt picture 10 times deeper than the official books show, and a home market shrinking while the rest of the world builds higher walls. BYD isn't finished. The scale, the technology, the global footprint, none of that evaporates overnight. But the chapter where BYD looked untouchable, where every quarter was a new record and every headline was a new country won, that chapter is closed. What's being written now is harder. A company trying to prove that the empire it built at extraordinary speed has the structural integrity to last. That the cracks showing on the surface don't run all the way to the foundation. Whether it does or it doesn't, that's the story worth watching. Drop a comment below and tell me what you think. Temporary turbulence for a company that still has more advantages than almost anyone in the industry, or the beginning of a longer unraveling that has implications far beyond BYD alone. I read every single one, and the best discussions on this channel happen right there in the comments. Hit the like button if this gave you something to think about. Subscribe if you want to be there when the next chapter of this story breaks. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one. Bye.